Another weekend, another capital D discourse. Does it at least count that I learned about this discourse while I was at the gym? Does that make it better? Hello, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well. And yes, I do want to talk about the going to the gym leftism discourse that occurred this weekend. But I want to talk less about the discourse itself, though I will touch upon it, and more on what this discussion symbolizes, because I think it is becoming more and more emblematic of a larger problem that has always existed within, leftist spaces, especially within the past few years, but has become more and more of a larger trend as we've seen the further enshittification of so many of our online platforms as we get further and further into capitalism in decline, aka fascism. Before we get to that, let's focus in on the specific. So there was a tweet that sort of took off this weekend that basically went something along the lines of leftists should go to the gym more. And oh boy, did this start off so many conversations. And instantaneously, you can kind of see why, because this sort of whole idea of like leftists need to go to the gym kind of touches upon a wide variety of topics that I think a lot of leftist folks want to have a lot of earnest, nuanced conversations about. I mean, you could talk about fat phobia and anti-fatness, about how we do a lot of fat shaming in our society. Maybe a lot of people can't go to the gym, and we need to talk about how our leftism needs to be more inclusive of different bodies. You can also talk about how, there's so much wrapped up in masculinity in terms of our fascistic society today, about how fascism sort of wraps up this like fitness culture of like being a man and like being strong and tough in our society today. But then you can also talk about how fitness is an important thing, and how access to fitness and access to good health is also something that leftists should be fighting for. Like, all of these are extremely nuanced topics that have numerous different intersections and discussions that we could be having, especially in how our very capitalist society today and very, white supremacist, racist society like interacts with all of these things. Like, again, it's a large system that just talking about the gym in a weird way just goes into. So I think that those are all great conversations to have. But what ended up happening was not any of that nuanced discourse, but a lot of people getting very angry at each other as this conversation happened. I learned about this discourse, and I'm not going to say their names and even talk about the specific topics, but I learned about the discourse from creator friends of mine who were having arguments with each other and having earnest, like really emotional, visceral, almost like just anxiety-inducing reactions to just things that they were saying to each other that were causing each other anger. And these are people that like I think are intelligent people, some make some of the smartest videos that I know. Again, I'm not going to say their names or call them out or anything because I don't think that's going to be useful, but like they were like people were going at each other. And I saw this just across the spectrum and board with so many people like being like, well, you're fat shaming when you're talking about this, or you're not talking about depression enough because not everyone can go to the gym. Again, those are all really worthwhile conversations that we need to be talking about in the intersection of mental health and all of these things and fitness and masculinity. It's worthwhile conversations. But it just devolved into anger, vitriol, and attacking each other. And to hone in on this point, the reason that they were angry at each other was because that their conversations were kind of coming at cross purposes to each other. Like, this is not exactly what they were talking about. This is a different topic, but just to use an example, you could talk about something like fat shaming and how we do fat shame in our society. And then someone else may take that and be like, yes, but I, as a person who deals with anorexia or deals with eating disorders, has a problem with how we discuss fat in our society and how we discuss these topics when it comes to like, me being shamed for having an eating disorder and needing to get bulked up and needing to go to the gym more and how that sort of intersects there. And so like, these are two conversations that are not incompatible with each other, and I actually think are very important to discuss in conversation with each other. But because this, and again, this is an example, not exactly what happened, but because they were put into like this discourse churn online, they were seen as like cross-purpose conversations with each other. So one person tweeted and then another person tweeted, and because they were just like limited to these like just only a certain amount of characters that they could portray their thoughts within, and because tweets are literally seen as like you're responding to another person, and response is seen as like me versus you, back and forth, that sort of debate mentality, it was just seen as not a conversation, but a battle. And it eventually devolved into such, to the point where like people's feelings were legitimately hurt. And that all comes down to the platform itself generating that type of conversation that was against each other, and people not having the opportunity to be able to create a conversation, but the platform itself engaging negative emotions to be able to constantly force more engagement on the platform. And this has been not just a dynamic that I saw with this discourse, but one that I see over and over and over and over again. And it is an increasing problem that has always existed within leftist spaces, but one that, especially in the online sphere, has been getting exacerbated more and more and more. We have currently seen the enshittification of so many different platforms. I mean, look at the artist formerly known as Twitter under Elon Musk, and how he has tried to wring every little cent that he can out of it while slowly destroying it and making it a far-right site. And in doing that, sort of like squeezing the money of it, he has pushed it further and further to the right, because he's sort of allowed people like libs of TikTok and Jordan Peterson and actual neo-Nazis back onto the platform in order to just generate discourse based on anger and hatred and vitriol, because that's what makes money. Engagement, especially on these platforms, comes out of anger and in a way also addiction, like addiction to like money. I mean, look at video games. You have like, you know, I really wanted to play the new Suicide Squad Killed the Justice League game, but it's really just become like a live service game that so many games are now becoming, where it was just trying to wring as much money out of you as possible. Even if that game doesn't necessarily do that right now, you can clearly tell that was the intent at some point. Numerous games have been doing that. I mean, look at like Arkham Knights and all these other games that I would have been interested in as a DC fan years ago, but just become these like faux or actual live service things that just are clearly there to just wring your time, money, and effort, and just like and not actually engage nuanced thought or emotion or action through the stories or through the conversations, but just trying to engage your time and your labor. And that's what we're seeing too with these sort of discourses constantly being provoked with this workout discourse. It is a tweet that someone made that then gets funneled into the system of these of this need to look at everything on social media as something that we are in a combative reading with. And other creators have talked about different ways of reading things, like combative readings or restorative readings. And social media really encourages combative readings of looking at things and seeing it as something like, where can I find the problem in this? Where can I find where I am not represented in this, where I am not being discussed in this, or where this creator has, or person making this tweet has made a mistake? And combat it from a place of anger and vitriol, and attack it from that to make my voice heard. Because so many of us feel earnestly that our voice isn't heard today, because it isn't. But I ultimately think when we come at it from a combative sense, it is ultimately not going to help anybody. Our capitalist, growing fascistic society wants us to play by being angry at each other all the time. And this is not just something on Twitter, but I see it on YouTube and things like that. Like, I did a video recently about how we talk about trans men. And that video was instigated by the fact that there was I'm not going to relitigate that whole discussion. I think there's an earnest and really worthwhile discussion being had on that video in the comment sections. And I still am certainly learning, and I screwed things up in that video of things as well, too. But like, that came out of, I said something in a Barbie video that honestly I think was, it was a wrong way to phrase that conversation, and showcased a bias and a blind spot in my own thinking around how I think about trans men sometimes, and sort of when I'm not directly talking about trans men in my work. And some trans men had a very earnest, honest, and understandable reaction to that line in the video and got angry about it. And I saw someone posting that was getting a lot of traction that was really upset about it, but then getting angry at me specifically as the creator of the video and saying that I hate trans men. And again, this is not to attack that person, but more to just discuss the framing of how that came out, is like, oh, Jessie must hate trans men, or this is a thing that I'm going to be in a combative discussion with. And so I made the video because I wanted to honestly acknowledge that the feeling that they had around that moment in my video was legitimate, and that I had caused that, and I want to take ownership of that. But then try to create a conversation of how can I do better, and not have it be like, oh, how I need to be put down and shut up, but more, how can I listen and have a conversation about where I was coming from, and make myself understand that conversation, while also trying to, have a larger conversation about like how I can lift up voices that aren't always as heard, especially in the trans community as often. Admit that like I needed to learn, but try to come at a place of like, let's have a conversation about this. And I'm still in that conversation. I still haven't fully gotten there, and I want to like learn to do better. And I want to thank all the trans men who are having these really wonderful conversations in that comment sections that I'm learning so much from. Not all of it I agree with, some of it I disagree with, some of it I have issues with, and maybe it'll make it into a video at some point down the line. But I think all of them are very open and vulnerable conversations that I think are very worthwhile. And it can happen on social media that those conversations happen. But it is so often that like we are asked to make these declarative statements online, whether it be a video creator like myself making a video or, someone making a tweet, and it's seen as like this crystallized version of what that person is. And then we attack it. We come at it as if that's like emblematic of the person, instead of an artifact of something that they were thinking at the time or working through. We don't engage with art or even tweets or creations as an artifact of a person's thinking at a moment, but emblematic of an entire person, and use that as a way to attack because of our culture of capitalism just wanting you to constantly be engaging the worst possible impulses to generate more engagement and labor and emotion. And so it's kind of these like two mixtures of things of how our society is just constantly wanting you to engage on a not intellectual level, but just an emotional gut negative reaction level, as well as just constantly put out more and more labor and emotional labor. And then our also societal impulse to constantly encapsulize people in just singular statements or moments, trying to just say that this is what a person is, instead of a person being this evolving being over time. And that is what has caused so much of the constant breakings of solidarity in so much of our discourses. And again, this is not something new. I mean, you can go and look back throughout history of the United States and elsewhere and find that this has been something that, so many groups have done. You see Ronald Reagan trying to break up labor unions by setting, the labor organizers versus the people in the actual labor movements. Back, I believe, when Ronald Reagan stopped air traffic controller strikes, like one of his first moves before actually saying that the strike was illegal and firing all the air traffic controllers was to say like, oh, the head of the unions lied to you and you need to get back to work because they didn't tell you that I was going to do this. And so like his point was to try to like play off an axis of power and set people against each other.
And I am hoping that they will, in a sense, remove themselves from the lawbreaker situation by returning to their posts. I have no way to know whether this had been conveyed to them by their union leaders, who had been informed that this would be the result of a strike.
And you've seen that all the way through like suffragettes, like the white suffragettes were put against black folks with like being like, oh, the white woman's right to vote is against black people's right to vote. It's a constant thing that, capitalism does, that neoliberalism does, that white supremacist society does, colonialism does. It's the purpose of it. But it has just taken this unique form in the social media age, where like just the very platforms on which we have this discourse, the very platforms by which we think we are trying to do organizing now on, are actually themselves what are causing the fissures and fractures among ourselves. I mean, hell, you can even look at like, all the drama stuff that happens on YouTube that, again, I'm not like saying, oh, I'm above it. Like I've been involved in it myself, that like generates views and generates all of this shit that, like encourages us to make more money and get more views and do better in the algorithm, but itself is just breaking down lines of solidarity. And to really hone in on like the fact that I am not innocent in this discourse at all, I mean, look at my platform. The 3 biggest videos on my channel are ones that are all about like combative readings of specific like creators' work who I am seen as like at odds with. So like my number 1 video is the video I did on Sia's Music, the very very problematic autistic movie that she did. My other 2 ones are on J.K. Rowling and Matt Walsh. Those are my 3 biggest videos that I've ever done, and they are specifically about like talking about reading treating those creators and their works in a very combative way, as rightfully I should to some degree, as a trans creator looking at J.K. Rowling and Matt Walsh, as an autistic person looking at Sia's music. But it is fascinating to me that those are the works of mine that get rewarded, rather than, you know, the works that I put into about like talking about nuance of things like my Star Trek videos, or my love and appreciation of works like Guardians of the Galaxy or other things like that. Like, those are not what is appreciated, especially from my voice as a trans person, as a marginalized person. But my work is seen as like these things where I'm combating these creators in a larger hierarchy. That's what gets valued in this discourse. But when I talk about things that I love, that I cherish, the algorithm doesn't value it, because it does not value trans and queer and marginalized joy or interests or subjects. It only values our voice when we are placed into a combative churn. And that's why so many leftists and marginalized folks who are fighting for actual liberation end up falling into this reactionary movement. It's because it's the only time that our engagement with topics that we are passionate about get any sense of reward from larger society, from capitalism. You know, when we talk about things that we are angry about, capitalism will prop that up. They'll make news articles about it. They'll get higher engagements on Twitter. You know, there'll be discussions about it to frame us in these antagonistic mindsets. But then we fall into it because it's like, oh, look, I am being propped up for this. And again, I put myself into this. I made so many videos about anti-trans bullshit. We end up falling into, like, we can only have the reactive conversation. And that is how fascism constantly gets propped up. That's what fascists want. They get to dictate the conversation. We react to it, and then we actually don't get to be able to have any larger conversations about what we want to do to move beyond, to build something better. I mean, hell, this is exactly why Democrats constantly fall for the Republican push to the right and towards fascism. I mean, just look at the immigration bill that the Democrats tried to pass the past few weeks, where it was literally, they were just putting up a right-wing immigration bill. And the only reason it didn't get passed was because Republicans were like, we have to be against the Democrats. But in all honesty, the Democrats put it up because they said, well, I guess we can't do any good immigration reform, so we'll just do a right-wing one because maybe the Republicans will vote for it. Because that's what gets rewarded. They want to feel this dopamine rush of them having accomplished stuff, and so they make horrific, awful legislation because they constantly let the fascists and the right-wing dictate the conversation instead of actually doing the work to push forward and try to see a society that we could make beyond this. But I don't place that necessarily as a Democrat thing to do. They are part of the institution. They are always going to prop up the institution. But now we are seeing it, and this is where I really want to hone in on this, and this is not just something new, but again, we're seeing it very much in social media. We are seeing it more and more within our communities because we are constantly forced on being reactive, because it's the only time our voices are ever seen as being heard, when we are in combative modes with each other rather than in modes of being constructive or restorative with our discourse. And it's the very platforms by which we organize on, the very online worlds that we have built up are themselves the things that are eroding our solidarity because they have been so overridden with capitalist impulses at this point. You know, there was a time back in the day when the internet was just forming where it was much more free and open, and you know, the capitalist drive wasn't as is insidiously baked into every part of the platform, where organizing could really happen. And you know, there was still a lot of problems, and there's a lot of racism in those groups, a lot of queerphobia, transphobia in that type of organizing, as well as there always is in physical spaces as well. But they were they were more part of the dynamics of the groups rather than the dynamics that the platforms themselves were encouraging. And so it's just something that I want to kind of encourage you all to be thinking about when it comes to, as we are currently seeing the larger and larger enshittification of online platforms, to be thinking about online organizing as something that is less and less of a priority, and be really more thinking about physical space and be thinking about finding spaces with people in real life to organize with, or being more intentional if you are doing online organizing with how you build that platform in a way that is encouraging to discourse and disagreement in a way that can be constructive. Because the platforms themselves are not actually helping that. And I say that as someone who is a YouTube creator, and it's something that I try, you know, to think about quite often, because it's like I make videos like this in other places, and while I work hard to try to make like my comment sections and my Patreons and my tweets as best I can, though Twitter's a hellscape, to be like a place where like we can have these conversations. Like there's only so much I can do when the platform itself is made to do that. Like I can't be deleting comments in my comment section all the time because it would drive me mad. I kind of already does. And so it's just one of those things that, like, use creators like myself or your favorite video essayists or streamers or whoever as like good places to like learn ideas, to engage with ideas, to maybe start to find some sense of community, but then use that as a springboard to build your own, thought process and conversations and groups. Hopefully I'm making sense in all of this, and I know it's just springing off of this like very cursed workout discourse that happened this weekend, but I think this is just something that I think we really, as people trying to organize against things like the ongoing genocide in Gaza and Palestine against Palestinians right now, or the constant rising fascism in the United States, or the attacks against queer people and trans people in the United States and UK and elsewhere, and white supremacist society, as people who wants to fight back against all of those things. Like, I think this is something that we really need to be self-aware of and understand that these discourses that just set us against each other aren't ultimately going to be helpful. Because ultimately these discourses are intentionally myopic and destructive. Like, yes, I think there's so many things we could discuss when it comes to the gym and all of that stuff within a leftist framework, but is this discourse really what we need to be focusing on right now? Is it really what we need to have our emotional labor going into? Is it really what we need to be breaking down lines of solidarity around, to have like literal people just having anxiety attacks and trauma and PTSD over? And I'm not trying to overplay it. Like, I had people who were literally expressing that to me over this discourse. Is this really what we want to like be having these breakdowns over like intentionally myopic discourses that remove nuance on social media, versus like the larger conversations that we need to be having around things like the ability for people to be able to exercise, and fat shaming and anti-fatness, as well as the much more pressing and important conversations around like fighting active genocides happening in the world right now, that are like we need to be focusing on most clearly and have our eye on the ball on. But instead, we get wrapped up in these myopic conversations. And that's because social media itself wants to create those myopic, destructive discourses. That is not me saying that there is something wrong with someone wanting to talk about like, hey, I felt, left out or hurt when we were talking about, going to the gym and in my specific intersection of it. But just to say that, like, when people are being vulnerable with you about talking about those things, let's create a space where that's not a place to come at it combatively, but create a space to have an open discourse about it. And be thinking specifically, and this is the final point I'll end on because I know I'm starting to ramble here, be thinking specifically of who is the most vulnerable in that conversation. And when I say that, I'm not trying to like have an oppression Olympics thing of like, oh, this person's more vulnerable than that person, but more ask like, whose voice has not been heard? And how can I do my best to make sure that I am uplifting and letting that person's voice feel heard? And then maybe when it's, my turn, be able to, if I disagree, create that conversation where we have a conversation across that, but making sure that that vulnerable person's voice is heard, even if I do end up disagreeing with it, instead of being like, no, you're wrong. Just try to be thinking about how to enable people's voices to be heard, while also, allowing yourself to be heard as well. It's a complicated thing. I don't have all the answers to it, but it's something that certainly Twitter and other online platforms are not going to be ever helpful in enabling.